Let's start with a simple question. How far would you go for a banana? Maybe you'd walk to the kitchen. Maybe if you're feeling adventurous, you'd go to the grocery store. But imagine going to war. Imagine sending soldiers, ships, and artillery halfway across the world because someone raised the price of bananas by a few cents. No, this isn't a joke, though it absolutely sounds like one. This is a story about how, for nearly half a century, the United States fought wars, yes, actual wars, in the name of bananas. This is not the history your teacher told you. This is capitalism with a machete, diplomacy with a fruit basket, and imperialism wearing a tropical shirt. This is the story of the Banana Wars, when corporate boardrooms in Boston and New Orleans quietly commanded the U.S. Marines to invade small countries in Central America and the Caribbean. And the wildest part? It worked. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. Because tonight we're going to drift through a story that's equal parts absurd and alarming. A tale of businessmen, soldiers, revolutionaries, and of course a lot of bananas. It all starts in the late 1800s, an era when America was young, restless, and had just discovered that making money overseas was way more fun than making it at home. The railroads had stitched the nation together. The oil barons were getting richer. The American flag was quietly stretching beyond its borders. And somewhere between all that ambition and a craving for tropical fruit, a group of clever businessmen realized something extraordinary. Bananas were the perfect product. They were cheap, exotic, and, most importantly, perishable. You couldn't store them for long, which meant if Americans got hooked, they'd have to keep buying them, over and over, forever. And so began one of the strangest corporate love stories in history, between the United States of America and the humble banana. Picture New Orleans, 1899. The docks smell like salt and sweat. Steamships glide in from the Caribbean, their bellies filled not with gold or silver, but with thousands of bunches of bananas. Unloading them are workers covered in grime, tossing the fruit like cannonballs. Watching all this from the pier is a man named Minor Cooper Keith, a railroad tycoon who somehow ended up running an empire made of fruit. Keith wasn't originally in the banana business. He was building a railroad in Costa Rica, or trying. The jungle ate men for breakfast. Disease took hundreds of his workers. He lost his fortune and nearly his life. But when the Costa Rican government couldn't pay him back, they offered him something else instead: land. Miles and miles of tropical land, perfect for growing bananas. Keith thought, why not? He started exporting a few crates to the U.S., and when those bananas sold like crazy, he realized he'd struck gold, yellow gold. Fast forward a few years, and Keith teamed up with another fruit mogul, Andrew Preston, who ran a company in Towson City, Boston. Together they created a business so powerful it would one day topple governments. They called it the United Fruit Company. It began innocently enough, just some businessmen selling fruit. But soon, United Fruit became something more like a country. It owned ships, it owned railroads, it owned telegraph lines, ports, and even entire towns. It didn't just grow bananas, it grew influence. And when that influence was threatened, well, it had a very powerful friend, the U.S. government. See, by the early 1900s, America had fully embraced a new hobby: intervening. If there was a revolution or a coup, or even a rumor of one in Latin America, the U.S. would send in the Marines, usually to protect American interests. And if those interests happened to involve banana plantations, well, that was purely coincidence, of course. Take Honduras, for instance. In the early 1900s, it was a small, peaceful country with lush jungles and a lot of debt. United Fruit loved Honduras. The land was perfect for bananas, and the local politicians were easily persuaded by a few friendly bribes and promises of railroads. But soon, the company had competition. Other fruit companies were moving in, slicing the country into zones of influence like it was a tropical game of Monopoly. Fighting broke out between rival factions, each backed by a different fruit company. And when the chaos started threatening profits, Who do you think showed up? That's right, the U.S. Navy. Officially, they were there to protect American citizens. Unofficially, they were there to make sure the bananas kept flowing. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next few decades, American troops landed in Cuba, Panama, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and several other countries, all under similar circumstances. Each time there was some noble-sounding reason to promote stability, democracy, or order. But behind the speeches and the flags, there were telegrams from United Fruit executives saying, essentially, "Hey, things are getting messy down here. Could you send a few ships?" And America did. These weren't massive wars, not in the traditional sense. There were no D-Days, no Gettysburgs, but they were constant, small invasions, occupations, and peacekeeping missions that dragged on for years. So constant, in fact, that U.S. Marines started calling them the Banana Wars. The Marines themselves had mixed feelings about it. Some saw it as adventure, tropical duty with a side of glory. Others joked that they weren't soldiers anymore. They were just expensive security guards for fruit companies. One officer, Major Smedley Butler, a man who won 2 Medals of Honor, later confessed something remarkable. He said, "I spent 33 years in the Marines, most of it being a high-class muscle man for big business." He called himself a racketeer for capitalism and admitted he'd helped make countries safe, not for democracy, but for companies like United Fruit. And there it is, the quiet, cynical truth at the heart of this story. For the people living in those countries, the Banana Wars weren't a quirky footnote. They were invasions, occupations, and coups that shaped entire generations. In Nicaragua, U.S. Marines stayed for 21 years. In Haiti, they rewrote the Constitution to let foreigners own land. In Honduras, American companies owned so much territory that locals nicknamed their country a Banana Republic. That term, Banana Republic, didn't come from a joke. It came from the reality of a place whose government answered more to fruit companies than to its own citizens. And yet back home in the U.S., most people never heard about it. Bananas just showed up at breakfast tables, bright and cheap and sweet. No one asked too many questions about where they came from. But here's the irony. The Banana Wars weren't really about bananas. They were about control of land, labor, and narrative. Bananas were just the excuse, a convenient symbol, of America's growing appetite for global power. Still, it's hard not to laugh at the absurdity of it. The image of Marines landing on a Caribbean beach, rifles in hand, all to defend fruit. It's like if Pepsi invaded Canada because Coca-Cola got a better vending machine deal. Yet, absurd or not, it happened, over and over again. And each time, the United States would claim victory, pack up, and move on, leaving behind scars that took decades to heal. In the next part of our story, we'll drift deeper into this strange empire, where businessmen in suits played puppet masters with countries, revolutions brewed in banana fields, and propaganda painted it all as progress. But for now, as you rest and picture those endless tropical coastlines under the American flag, remember, sometimes the most ridiculous wars are the ones fought for the smallest things. And in the early 20th century, the smallest thing, the banana, turned out to be powerful enough to bend history itself. It's easy to think of the Banana Wars as some strange fever dream from the past, a brief tropical misadventure before America went back to more serious business. But in reality, the fruit companies weren't just shipping bananas. They were exporting a system, and that system, built on money, politics, and a remarkable lack of moral hesitation, worked far too well. Imagine this. You're a small Central American country in the early 1900s. Your land is fertile. Your people are hardworking, and your government, well, it changes every few years depending on who has more guns. Then one day, a group of men in suits arrive. They promise railroads, schools, and jobs. They speak in polite English, and they have the backing of the United States. They say they'll bring modernization, and to be fair, they do. They lay down tracks, open ports, build telegraph lines, and bring in ships that connect your country to the world. But slowly, you start noticing something odd. The trains don't go where you want them to. They go where the bananas are. The schools don't teach your history. They teach theirs. And when your government tries to tax them or change a law, they threaten to leave, or worse, to call Washington. That was the United Fruit Company model in a nutshell. A perfect blend of soft power, hard cash, and the subtle art of making other people think it's for their own good. In Costa Rica, they built railroads and employed thousands. In Guatemala, they practically owned the country. In Honduras, they didn't just grow bananas, they grew presidents. It became a running joke that whenever the Honduran government needed money, it would just print a new president. Elections were more like business meetings, and the minutes were written on company letterhead. The company controlled the banks, the harbors, and the newspapers. If a journalist criticized them, he'd find himself mysteriously unemployed. If a worker tried to unionize, he'd disappear into the jungle, and no one would ask where he went. In many towns, the company script, not the national currency, was used to pay wages. You couldn't spend it anywhere else. It was like living in a theme park, only the theme was corporate feudalism. Meanwhile, back in the United States, bananas were now a staple. They were cheap, cheerful, and absurdly popular. Americans were eating so many of them that the fruit had become part of national culture. There were banana ads, banana recipes, banana jokes. The United Fruit Company's marketing team went to work like poets of capitalism. They painted bananas as healthy, modern, and even patriotic. Because nothing says freedom like a fruit grown under military occupation. And Americans ate it up, literally and figuratively. But beneath the glossy posters and cheerful slogans, the ground was starting to shift. The early 1900s were an age of revolutions. All across Latin America, people were growing tired of being told what to do, especially by men who didn't even live there. One of those places was Nicaragua. In 1912, after yet another civil war, the United States decided to step in. Officially, they were there to restore order. Unofficially, they were there to make sure the canal route and the banana business stayed friendly to American interests. The Marines landed, and they stayed, and stayed. By the time they left in 1933, they'd been there for 21 years. They fought rebels in the jungles. They trained local armies. They rewrote constitutions. It was less like peacekeeping and more like long-term property management. And in the middle of it all was a man named Augusto Cesar Sandino, a rebel leader who refused to bow down to either his own corrupt government or the Americans propping it up. Sandino became a legend, a symbol of resistance, fighting with whatever he had. His followers called him a hero. The U.S. called him a bandit. But what he really was tired of seeing his country turned into someone else's plantation. He fought the Marines for 6 long years. In the end, the Americans withdrew, but the system they'd built didn't vanish. Soon after, Sandino was betrayed and assassinated. His death cleared the way for a man named Anastasio Somoza, whose family would rule Nicaragua for decades, with U.S. backing, of course. And so the wheel turned, a rebellion crushed, a puppet installed, and the bananas kept shipping out right on schedule. If Nicaragua was the stage, then Haiti was the rehearsal for something even more surreal. In 1915, after a series of coups and assassinations, American troops landed there too. The official story, to protect American citizens and restore order. The unofficial story, to protect U.S. business interests and, conveniently, to keep German companies from getting involved in the Caribbean during World War I. The occupation lasted 19 years. During that time, the U.S. rewrote Haiti's constitution, specifically to let foreigners own land, which had previously been illegal. Haitians resisted, and when they did, they were met with overwhelming force. Entire villages were burned. Thousands died. The press at home called it spreading civilization. The locals called it something else entirely. Even today in Haiti, there's a memory, not of democracy being delivered, but of sovereignty being stolen. Meanwhile, the Marines were getting tired too. For them, the banana wars were like a bad rerun. Different country, same plot. They'd land, pacify a region, train a local army, and then leave, only for the same chaos to erupt again. It was like mowing the world's most rebellious lawn. Major Smedley Butler, the same Marine we met earlier, became one of the most decorated soldiers in U.S. history. But after retiring, he turned on the whole idea. He gave speeches calling himself a gangster for capitalism. He said, "I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909-1912. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies." And then he said, "Looking back on it, I feel I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. The Marines operated on 3 continents. It's funny, in a dark, tragic way, how even the men doing the fighting saw the irony. They were heroes on paper, but in their own eyes, they'd been working security for fruit barons." Now let's zoom out for a moment. All this, the invasions, the occupations, the puppet governments, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was part of a larger American philosophy known as the Big Stick Policy. Coined by President Theodore Roosevelt, it went something like this: "Speak softly and carry a big stick, or you will go far." And Roosevelt's big stick wasn't a metaphor. It was the U.S. Navy. The idea was simple. The U.S. would act as a kind of international policeman in the Western Hemisphere. If any Latin American country misbehaved, or even looked like it might default on its debts, America would step in to stabilize things. It sounded noble, it looked imperial. And in practice, it meant one thing. If a corporation's profits were threatened, a battleship would appear on the horizon. The result was a pattern that historians later called gunboat diplomacy. Because nothing says friendly negotiation, quite like parking a warship off someone's coast. And yet this was considered normal. Editorials in U.S. newspapers praised these actions as spreading order and progress. Few questioned why progress always seemed to follow the same shipping routes as the United Fruit Company's fleet. Those ships, by the way, had their own name, the Great White Fleet, gleaming vessels that carried bananas north and influence south. They weren't just transporting fruit, they were carrying an empire in disguise. By the 1920s, the United Fruit Company wasn't just a business anymore. It was a government, a monopoly, and a propaganda machine wrapped in one yellow peel. It employed over 60,000 people, owned 3.5 million acres of land across a dozen countries, and controlled most of the trade routes between the Caribbean and the United States too. Its executives dined with presidents, funded political campaigns, and wrote foreign policy memos that somehow ended up on the president's desk. They had a nickname for their influence: El Pulpo, the octopus, because their tentacles reached everywhere, and the scariest part? The more control they gained, the more invisible they became. The average American saw a 5-cent banana and thought, what a deal. They didn't see the Marines, or the coups, or the dictatorships that made it possible. By now, the banana wars had become a kind of quiet addiction, not for the fruit, but for the power. The U.S. had gotten used to playing referee, landlord, and enforcer in the tropics, and every time it intervened, it convinced itself it was doing the right thing. That's the trick with empire. It never starts with conquest. It starts with good intentions, and then a few missing details about who profits. In the next part of our story, we'll watch how this fruit-fueled empire starts to unravel, when one country finally says enough, and the United Fruit Company finds itself facing not just angry workers, but a revolution. For now, though, let's rest with this thought. Empires don't always march under banners or wear crowns. Sometimes they just ship bananas and call it business. By the 1930s, the United Fruit Company was at its peak. It was no longer just a fruit company, it was the fruit company. If you lived in Central America, you either worked for them, worked under them, or worked around them. If you were the president of a country, you probably owed them a favor, or several. And if you were an American consumer, you probably ate their product every morning without knowing any of this existed. The octopus had wrapped its tentacles around everything. Governments, railroads, radio stations, and even religion. In some company towns, priests were hired to bless new banana crops. Workers were told that the fruit was a gift from God, a gift that just happened to require 14-hour workdays in sweltering heat. But as the 1930s rolled on, even the octopus started to feel a little nervous, because history, as it often does, was getting ready to push back. In 1929, the Great Depression hit the United States like a hurricane. Factories closed, banks collapsed, people lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings, and suddenly, no one was buying as many bananas. Demand dropped. Profits plunged. The United Fruit Company had to cut costs, and cutting costs usually meant cutting people. In Colombia, where United Fruit had huge plantations, workers were already on edge. They lived in company housing, bought from company stores, and were paid in company script that could only be used on company property. When the Depression hit, they snapped. Thousands of banana workers went on strike. They demanded better wages, real money instead of scrip, and something radical: weekends. The company called it communism. The workers called it basic human dignity. And then, one night in December 1928, the Colombian army decided to settle the dispute. They surrounded a crowd of striking workers gathered in a town square in Ciénaga. The soldiers opened fire. The number of people killed is still debated. The company said a few dozen. Witnesses said hundreds. Some said over 1,000. The truth disappeared beneath the tropical rain, and the bodies disappeared into mass graves. The Colombian government, under pressure from the U.S., quickly buried the incident, and United Fruit continued business as usual. But that massacre, known today as the Banana Massacre, left a scar across Latin America that never fully healed. It was proof that this wasn't just business anymore. It was domination with paperwork. The 1930s and 1940s brought another wave of change, this time global. World War II had redefined power. Empires were crumbling. Colonies were demanding independence. In this new world, the idea of invading a country for fruit started to look awkward. So the United States switched tactics. Instead of Marines, it sent money. Instead of battleships, it used contracts, loans, and advisors. It was imperialism with better branding. The Cold War made everything even simpler. If a Latin American leader wanted to raise wages or nationalize land, the U.S. didn't see it as economic reform. It saw it as communism. And when the word communism appeared, fruit suddenly became a matter of national security. By the early 1950s, one country in particular had started to worry the United Fruit Company: Guatemala. Guatemala was practically a United Fruit Company property by then. The company owned the best land, the railroads, the ports, the telegraph lines, and even controlled the postal service. But in 1950, a new president was elected, Jacobo Arbenz. He was young, idealistic, and, most dangerously, not on the company. Payroll, Arbenz looked at his country and saw something obvious. Less than 3% of the population owned 70% of the land, and most of that land belonged to foreign corporations. So he introduced a plan, a simple one. He would buy unused land from the big landowners and redistribute it to the peasants who actually worked it. It wasn't revolutionary. It was practical. Even polite. He offered to pay fair market value. But United Fruit didn't see politeness. They saw a threat. They claimed Arbenz was a communist, because apparently giving land to poor people was the first step toward Stalinism. And they knew exactly how to deal with that. At this point, United Fruit had friends in high places, very high places. The U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had once been their lawyer. His brother, Alan Dulles, was now the head of the CIA, and also a former United Fruit Board member. Yes, you heard that right. The company trying to overthrow the Guatemalan government had its own people running U.S. foreign policy. It was the corporate equivalent of writing a complaint letter to the manager and realizing you are the manager. So, in 1954, the CIA launched Operation PB Success, because even coups need branding. They trained a small army of Guatemalan exiles, hired mercenaries, and broadcast fake radio messages claiming a massive rebellion was underway. They bombed a few airfields, terrified the public, and convinced the Guatemalan military that Arbenz had lost control. Within days, Arbenz resigned and fled the country. The new U.S.-approved government promptly returned all confiscated land to United Fruit. Democracy was restored, if by democracy you mean corporate ownership. And so without a single Marine landing on shore, America had fought. And won. Another banana war. The aftermath was grim. In the years that followed, Guatemala fell into a brutal civil war that lasted for more than 3 decades. Over 200,000 people died or disappeared. The United States claimed it was fighting communism. But to many Guatemalans, it felt like they were fighting for their right to grow their own crops on their own land. The irony, of course, is that by trying to stop communism, the U.S. ended up creating the very conditions that fueled it. Meanwhile, back in the States, United Fruit tried to clean up its image. They hired public relations experts, including a man named Edward Bernays, the so-called father of modern PR. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew, which might explain why he understood how to get inside people's heads. Bernays created Glossy, campaigns to portray bananas as symbols of health, family, and the American way. He sent journalists on paid tropical tours of banana plantations, clean, staged, photogenic ones. He launched radio ads, newspaper features, and even arranged for banana breakfast events across the country. He managed to make fruit patriotic. It was brilliant, it was cynical, and it worked. No one remembered the massacres or the coups. They just remembered the smiling family peeling a bright yellow banana while the announcer said, "Nutrition never tasted so good," but the world was changing again. By the 1960s and 70s, revolutions were sweeping across Latin America. Old dictatorships were crumbling. Nationalism was replacing colonialism. The United Fruit Company, once unstoppable, was beginning to rot from the inside. Labor strikes, bad publicity, and political backlash were chipping away at its power. And then in 1970, it made a spectacularly bad business move. It merged with a meatpacking company called AMK to form United Brands. Yes, the same empire that once ruled half of Central America was now selling sausages. And then, in 1975, its CEO, Eli Black, committed suicide by jumping from his office in the Pan Am building in New York. Investigations later revealed that United Brands had been bribing the president of Honduras to get tax breaks. The scandal destroyed the company's reputation. Its stock collapsed. The octopus finally started losing its grip. Yet even as United Fruit faded, its legacy remained. In the economies it had shaped, the governments it had toppled, and the phrase it left behind. Banana Republic. That term, once a dark joke, is now a part of everyday language. We use it to describe fragile states ruled by corruption and corporate greed, without realizing it was born from very real blood and soil. The banana wars weren't just about fruit. They were about the birth of a new kind of empire, one that didn't need to conquer with armies when it could conquer with contracts. In the next part, we'll explore how the ghost of United Fruit lingered long after its decline, how its methods were copied, evolved, and reborn in the world of modern corporate politics. Because while the banana wars may have ended, the game they started never really did. For now, as you drift off, picture those endless rows of banana trees under the moonlight. Quiet, swaying, innocent. If you didn't know the history, you'd never guess that beneath those leaves once lay the battlefields of an invisible empire. By the time the 1960s rolled in, The world had started catching on to the game. Colonialism was out of fashion. Empires were rebranding. And United Fruit, that polished corporate conquistador, found itself standing in the middle of a global identity crisis. The company had always thrived in shadows, hidden behind slogans like bringing civilization and spreading prosperity. But now, those same words sounded hollow. People were starting to ask uncomfortable questions, like why prosperity always seemed to stop at the company gates. In the Caribbean, protests erupted. In Central America, nationalism was rising. And in the United States, the television age had arrived. A world where cameras could broadcast uncomfortable truths straight into living rooms. Suddenly, glossy ads of happy banana pickers didn't look quite as convincing when real footage showed malnourished workers and armed guards in the same frame. The United Fruit Company tried to adapt. It ran campaigns boasting of new schools, hospitals, and partnerships with local governments. It sounded benevolent, until you remembered that those governments had been hand-picked by the company in the first place. It was like congratulating yourself for donating to a charity that you secretly own. But despite the PR gloss, the cracks were spreading. In 1961, Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba sent shockwaves across the hemisphere. For decades, American corporations had operated in Latin America as if it were their private backyard. Now, a small island 90 miles from Florida had said no more. When Castro's government nationalized U.S. businesses, including plantations, Washington panicked. Suddenly, every reformer in Latin America looked like a potential Marxist, and every fruit field looked like the next battleground in the ties. Cold War, the irony. For the people who actually lived there, it wasn't about communism or capitalism. It was about finally owning the land their ancestors had worked for centuries. Meanwhile, United Fruit's once mighty empire was limping along. Competition from other banana companies had sliced into profits. Workers were unionizing. Political instability made it harder to maintain control. By the early 1970s, the company's share of the global banana market had fallen from nearly 90% to less than 25%. The octopus was losing its arms. But even in decline, it had influence and scandals. In 1974, United Fruit, now renamed United Brands, was caught bribing the Honduran government for tax cuts. It wasn't a small bribe. It was $1.25 million paid directly to the president. When the scandal broke, the company's CEO, Eli Black, jumped to his death from a skyscraper in Manhattan. The newspapers called it a tragic end to a great businessman. Others called it karma, the fall of a man who built fortunes on other people's soil. After the scandal, United Brands limped on. It merged, rebranded, and eventually became Chiquita Brands International, the same cheerful company with the smiling lady in a fruit hat. A perfect disguise for a not-so-cheerful past. But make no mistake, the spirit of United Fruit didn't die. It evolved. In the 1980s, the U.S. wasn't sending Marines to protect banana fields anymore. Now it was sending advisors to fight communism, armed with money, weapons, and sometimes very creative accounting. The tactics were cleaner, the motives less obvious. But the logic was the same. If a country's politics threatened American business interests, it would be stabilized. The banana wars had ended, but their DNA had entered a new body, the body of modern geopolitics. Take Honduras, for example, the original banana republic. By the 1980s, it had become a staging ground for U.S. operations in neighboring Nicaragua, where the Contra War was raging. Once again, the U.S. backed one side to stop the other, and once again, civilians paid the price. Different century, same story. Except this time, instead of bananas, the justification was ideology. But the infrastructure, the ports, the roads, the companies, all built during the old banana wars, made it possible. It's strange to think that a war in the jungle between Marxist rebels and anti-communist militias could trace its logistical roots back to banana railroads built in 1910. But history is funny that way. It keeps recycling itself, just with better marketing. And speaking of marketing, let's talk about Chiquita. By the late 20th century, the company had mastered the art of reinvention. Gone were the cigar-smoking executives and gunboats. In Dai's, their place came pastel packaging, friendly mascots, and jingles so catchy they could wash away entire coups. Chiquita Banana became one of the most recognizable brands in the world. Most people had no idea they were buying fruit from a company once accused of bribery, massacres, and meddling in elections. That's the power of time. It turns villains into nostalgia. But even in the 1990s and 2000s, the ghosts of the banana wars refused to stay buried. In Colombia, investigations revealed that Chiquita brands had paid millions of dollars to paramilitary groups, death squads, essentially, supposedly for protection. Those groups used the money to fund campaigns of terror that left thousands dead. Chiquita eventually admitted to the payments in U.S. court and paid a fine. But as usual, the price of corporate guilt was measured in dollars, not consequences. The company continued selling bananas. The world continued buying them. And the story rolled quietly on. Meanwhile, the phrase "banana republic" was mutating. It had started as a literal description, a country economically enslaved by fruit companies. But by the 21st century, it had become a metaphor, a shorthand for corruption, instability, and the illusion of democracy. We toss it around casually now. We call dysfunctional governments banana republics, without remembering where the term came from. From real sweat, real gunfire, real graves beneath real banana trees. There's something poetic about that. A war fought over fruit becomes a figure of speech. A massacre becomes a metaphor. And history, which should haunt us instead, just decorates our vocabulary. But for the people of Latin America, the legacy isn't abstract. It's in the land, in the railroads that still cut across jungles, in the borders drawn for profit, and in the distrust of foreign power that lingers to this day. The banana wars weren't just a weird episode in U.S. history. They were a blueprint, a user manual for how to control the world without technically owning it. And that blueprint has been reused over and over. Whenever a corporation moves in, extracts wealth, and calls it development, that's a ghost of the banana wars. Whenever a government justifies intervention with words like stability or security while protecting investments, that's the same old fruit-flavored imperialism, just with a Wi-Fi connection. We like to think we're smarter now, that we've outgrown that kind of exploitation, but maybe we've just made it less visible. Because in a world where money moves faster than ships ever did, who needs gunboats anymore? All you need is a trade agreement and a good publicist. The banana wars ended on paper in the 1930s, but their spirit lives in boardrooms, in treaties, in the quiet corridors where economics and politics still whisper to each other. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of going to war for bananas, because laughter feels safer than outrage. But beneath that absurdity lies the blueprint of modern empire. The United Fruit Company may be gone, but its methods are alive and well, dressed up in new industries, powered by new technologies, and still selling the same promise: progress, prosperity, and peace. For some, in the next part of our story, we'll slow down and drift back to how it all began. We'll look at why bananas, of all things, became the symbol of an empire, and how this sweet, silly fruit managed to change the course of nations for Yuan. Now, let the waves settle. Imagine the old steamships on the horizon, white hulls glinting in the sun, bringing fruit north and power south. And remember that behind every empire, there's always something small, something ordinary, that started it all. Sometimes it's gold, sometimes it's oil, and sometimes it's just a banana. Let's rewind for a moment, because it's easy to look back and think, wow, the United States really went to war for bananas? But at the time, it didn't feel quite so ridiculous, at least not to the people doing it. In the late 1800s, America was still figuring out what kind of empire it wanted to be. Europe had colonies everywhere: Africa, Asia, the Pacific. And the United States, freshly industrialized, looked around and thought, Well, we'd better get in on this, before it's all taken. But America didn't want to call it colonialism. That sounded old-fashioned, too British, too obvious. No, America wanted to do it better, subtler, with contracts instead of crowns, with companies instead of colonies. The banana, in that sense, was perfect. Bananas were the anti-colonial colonial fruit. They didn't need soldiers to spread, just railroads, ships, and cheap labor. And they offered something Americans couldn't resist, a taste of the tropics without ever leaving the suburbs. In the 1890s, a banana was an exotic luxury, something you'd show off at dinner parties. By the 1920s, it was the breakfast fruit, of choice for the average American family. That transformation from curiosity to necessity wasn't accidental. It was engineered. United Fruit and its rivals didn't just sell bananas. They sold a lifestyle. They ran ads telling Americans that bananas were the healthy modern snack, that they were for athletes, for children, for wholesome living. What they didn't mention was that behind every perfectly yellow bunch lay thousands of acres of cleared jungle, laborers paid in company tokens, and a foreign government quietly told to stay out of the way. It's impressive, really. They managed to make imperialism look nutritious. The company's founders were visionaries in a way that only 19th century tycoons could be. Ruthless, ingenious, and morally flexible. Minor C. Keith, one of the pioneers of the banana trade, started by building railroads in Costa Rica. When the government couldn't pay him, he asked for land instead. They gave him 800,000 acres of it, prime banana land. He didn't just build railroads, he built an empire. Tracks that were meant to connect cities soon connected plantations to ports, and ports to profits. Keith eventually merged his company with another American banana firm to form United Fruit. And from that moment on, the line between government and business began to blur. Not just in Central America, but in Washington too. The US government liked Keith. He was efficient. He got things done. He brought order to places that Americans thought were too chaotic for democracy, which, coincidentally, also made them perfect for plantations. The logic was circular but convenient. First, create economic dependence. Then, when the local population protests call it instability. Then, send in the Marines to restore order. Order, of course, meant making sure the bananas kept shipping. It's funny, or maybe tragic, how much power one fruit can have. Entire ports were built just to export it. Entire rail systems, entire cities grew around its trade. And behind, the fruit was a company so wealthy that it didn't need to conquer countries. It could simply rent them. Governments owed United Fruit so much money that their presidents took orders like employees. When elections didn't go the company's way, it funded coups. When laborers went on strike, it called in the army. And when bad weather or bad press hit, it sent lobbyists to Washington to remind senators how important bananas were to regional stability. And that's how the US military got into the fruit business. Between 1898 and 1934, US forces invaded or occupied nearly every Central American and Caribbean country that grew bananas. Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti. Sometimes they stayed for years. Sometimes they just dropped by to make a point. The official explanations were always noble: protecting American citizens, defending democracy, maintaining peace. The unofficial one was simpler: protecting the supply chain. In 1912, for instance, the US sent Marines into Nicaragua. The reason? Political unrest threatened American investments. The investments, of course, were bananas. A few years later, US forces landed in Haiti, supposedly to ensure financial stability. They stayed for 19 years, and in that time, the US rewrote the Haitian Constitution to allow foreign ownership of land, something previously forbidden. Guess who benefited? By the time the Banana Wars technically ended in the 1930s, the pattern was clear. When profits were threatened, flags followed fruit. But the beauty of America's approach was deniability. Unlike the British or French, U.S. didn't need colonies with governors and garrisons. It had companies, private, patriotic, and plausibly deniable. They could meddle, bribe, and even hire mercenaries. And if things went wrong, Washington could shrug and say, "Who us?" United Fruit was the perfect middleman for empire. It spoke the language of capitalism, but it acted with the authority of a state. It could issue orders that sounded like business plans but functioned like invasions. By the early 20th century, its reach was astonishing. In Guatemala alone, United Fruit owned nearly half the arable land, the railroads, the ports, even the phone lines. If you wanted to move, communicate, or trade, you had to go through them. It was less a company and more a shadow government with better stationery, and yet, for all its power, it still marketed itself as a humble fruit merchant, just helping America stay healthy one banana at a time. You almost have to admire the audacity. The irony is that the banana wars weren't really about bananas. They were about control, of land, of labor, of narrative. The banana was just the excuse that made exploitation palatable. It was soft, sweet, and harmless. The perfect mask for a hard, bitter truth. And that's why, even as we drift through these stories decades later, it's hard not to feel a kind of eerie calm, because it all feels so familiar. The slogans, the justifications, the belief that what's good for business must be good for everyone. It's the lullaby of empire, sung in every era, in every boardroom, in every war that wasn't technically a war. So, as you let the story sink in, picture the steamships again. White hulls gliding across blue water, crates of fruit stacked neatly below deck, flags fluttering in the breeze. Not as symbols of conquest, but of commerce. Because that's what the banana wars really were. Conquest disguised as trade. And in the next part, we'll watch how that disguise started to slip, how the fruit turned political, and how one company's empire would unravel in the most absurd, dramatic way possible. By the mid-20th century, the United Fruit Company wasn't just a business. It was a government with a marketing department. It owned land across 7 countries, employed more people than some armies, and could influence U.S. foreign policy with a few well-timed phone calls. Presidents listened, generals listened, journalists listened. And if they didn't, the company would find someone else who would. At its peak, United Fruit controlled over 40% of all banana imports to the United States. The fruit was cheap, reliable, and everywhere. From lunchboxes to hotel buffets, it was the quiet background music of the American diet. And behind that cheerful yellow color lay a story as dark as the jungle soil it grew from. By the 1950s, one country stood at the center of the company's empire: Guatemala, a small Central American nation, lush, volcanic, and, unfortunately for its citizens, rich in soil, perfect for bananas. United Fruit owned almost everything there that mattered: railroads, telegraphs, ports, and of course the best farmland. The Guatemalan government, meanwhile, had almost nothing, except perhaps the growing realization that this arrangement was a bit one-sided. Then came Jacobo Arbenz, a democratically elected president who believed rather radically that Guatemalans should benefit from Guatemalan land. Arbenz wasn't a communist. He wasn't even anti-American. He just wanted to modernize the country, to give peasants access to unused land so they could farm it themselves. It was a mild, practical reform plan to everyone except United Fruit, because that unused land just happened to be theirs. Hundreds of thousands of acres left idle for decades, not for lack of interest, but to keep prices high. Arbenz's government passed a law saying, if you own land you're not using, the state can buy it back and redistribute it. Seems fair enough. But the price would be based on what the company itself had declared for tax purposes. United Fruit had always undervalued its holdings to pay less tax. So when Guatemala offered to buy the land at that low price, the company was furious. Imagine getting caught by your own accounting tricks, and then deciding the solution is regime change. United Fruit went to Washington, not to the State Department at first, to Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations. Bernays had already convinced Americans that bacon and eggs were the traditional breakfast, and that women smoking cigarettes was a symbol, freedom. So naturally, United Fruit asked him to sell something else, a coup. He crafted a campaign portraying Guatemala as a communist threat. Articles appeared in major newspapers, written by independent journalists, who were actually on the company's payroll. Cartoons showed red flags rising over Central America. Suddenly, a small land reform looked like the beginning of a Soviet beachhead. The U.S. government, deep in Cold War paranoia, didn't need much convincing. In 1954, the CIA launched Operation Success, a secret mission to overthrow Arbenz. It armed and trained a rebel force, staged fake radio broadcasts, and flew bombers over Guatemala City to spark panic. The U.S. ambassador, who, by pure coincidence, had once been a lawyer for United Fruit, assured Washington that everything was under control. Arbenz resigned soon after, forced out by a manufactured revolution. The U.S. called it a victory for freedom. United Fruit called it good business, and Guatemala called it the beginning of 40 years of civil war. It's hard to overstate how absurdly corporate that coup was. A private company, angry about losing tax-dodged land, managed to get the world's most powerful country to topple a democracy. No tanks with company logos, no flags with fruit on them, just paperwork, propaganda, and perfectly respectable men in suits. It was capitalism's version of warfare, efficient, deniable, and profitable. After the coup, United Fruit got its land back. Washington congratulated itself for stopping communism. And the Guatemalan people, the ones the reform had been meant to help, found themselves worse off than before. It's one of those historical moments where you can almost hear the universe. Back in the U.S., the story was told differently. Newspapers celebrated the liberation of Guatemala. Reporters described grateful citizens waving at American planes. Few mentioned that those planes had dropped bombs on their capital. The operation was a masterclass in narrative control, the same skill United Fruit had been perfecting for half a century. You can't conquer the world with soldiers alone. You need a good story. And the company had always been the best storyteller of all. But power like that never lasts forever. The coup might have saved United Fruit's profits, but it also lit the fuse of its downfall. Because it exposed something the world couldn't unsee, that this wasn't just a business, it was empire in disguise. Soon, critics started calling it the octopus, with tentacles in every government, every newsroom, every port. And while the company still made billions, its image began to rot. As nationalism rose across Latin America, United Fruit became the perfect villain, the faceless foreign exploiter, and no amount of PR could make that look good anymore. By the 1960s, United Fruit's grip was slipping. Competitors entered the market. Governments grew bolder. The old formula, buy land, bribe officials, call in Marines, didn't work like it used to. The world was changing and the company wasn't keeping up, but it had already written the playbook that others would follow. Multinational corporations learned from its success and its excesses. They learned that you didn't need to invade countries if you could control their markets, that it was cheaper to buy politicians than to overthrow them, and that sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun, it's a trade agreement. The story of United Fruit is a story about evolution, not of a species, but of power. It's about how influence shifts shape to survive. Yesterday, it was a plantation owner with a pistol. Today, it's a CEO with a spreadsheet. The tools change, but the logic stays the same. And that's why the banana wars never really ended. They just went corporate. Picture it again. The slow roll of waves, the sound of ships unloading crates marked "Product of Guatemala." Dock workers, moving in rhythm, a breeze carrying the smell of ripe fruit and salt. The air hums with commerce, and somewhere, in a distant boardroom, a man lights a cigar and says, "It's just business." But history knows better. History knows that just business can change the fate of nations. That the fruit in your breakfast bowl once sparked revolutions and toppled governments, and that somewhere in those calm tropical nights, the echoes of those wars still whisper between the banana leaves. By the time the 1970s arrived, the jungle had grown quiet, not because peace had come, but because exhaustion had. The banana wars had left behind countries that looked the same from the outside. The same green hills, the same blue seas, the same golden fruit. But inside, the soil was tired, the people were wary, and the ghosts of past liberations still lingered, leaning against the docks like old sailors who'd seen too much. The world was moving on. Televisions had color now. America had landed on the moon. Empires were out of style, at least the kind that involved boots and bayonets. But corporations, as it turned out, didn't care about style. They'd simply change their uniforms. Suits instead of khaki, contracts instead of carbines. Chiquita Brands International, the polished, rebranded face of the old United Fruit, wanted to sound cheerful, innocent, even healthy. They had a logo, a catchy jingle, and a promise. Always fresh, always fun. But in the fine print of history, you could still smell the gunpowder. Their plantations kept growing, their ships kept sailing, and their money kept flowing through countries that had never really recovered from the wars of the early century. It's strange how easily people forget, how quickly violence becomes trivia once it's printed on glossy packaging. In the small towns of Honduras, Nicaragua, and Colombia, the rhythm of banana life continued. Wake at dawn. Work until the heat becomes unbearable. Load the fruit. Wash. The sweat, count the coins. To the outside world, it looked like peace. To the people living it, it felt like déjà vu, because the same patterns kept repeating. The same landowners, the same inequalities, the same political meddling dressed up as investment. The plantations had been modernized, yes, but the hierarchy remained ancient. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The distant hum of the conveyor belts, the clink of cargo chains, the faint sound of a radio playing in a field. A worker wipes his brow. A supervisor checks his watch. A freighter waits in the harbor, its name painted in cheerful blue letters. Everything looks normal. And that's the unsettling part. Because normal is often just the quiet between storms. In the late 20th century, Latin America became a testing ground for a new kind of empire, the economic one. Loans, trade deals, and corporate partnerships replaced gunboats, but the results were familiar. Dependency, inequality, control. Countries that tried to chart their own course found themselves nudged back in line by the invisible hands of the market, which, if you looked closely, always seemed to wear American sleeves. And through it all, the banana remained. A constant witness, quietly growing, quietly shipped, quietly symbolizing everything the modern world preferred not to talk about. Every fruit has a story. An apple tempted Eve. An orange named a dynasty. A banana built a blueprint for global capitalism. You can track the shape of the 20th century by following its peel. When the US wanted influence, bananas were the bait. When corporations wanted power, bananas were the excuse. And when people wanted freedom, bananas were often the reason they couldn't have it. The wars faded, but the pattern endured, disguised in slogans about progress and prosperity. It's almost poetic that bananas, once symbols of joy and simplicity, became metaphors for corruption and chaos. Banana Republic, two words that started as an inside joke among American businessmen, now define an entire political archetype. Its language doing what history does best, hiding tragedy behind a smile. When you hear Banana Republic, you might picture colorful shirts and palm trees. But underneath that postcard image lie generations who lived and died for someone else's profit. And maybe that's the most American thing of all, exporting not just goods, but stories. Stories that make empire sound like opportunity. Stories that turn exploitation into enterprise. For the people who lived through it, though, the story wasn't theory. It was personal. The soldiers who patrolled plantations weren't metaphors. The bullets were real. The missing fathers and burned villages weren't footnotes in an economics textbook. They were Tuesday. But history, like a good PR campaign, has a short attention span. It moves on quickly to the next trend, the next headline, the next market. And so the banana wars slipped into the past, dusty, exotic, and almost funny when told in hindsight. Almost. Today, the bananas in your kitchen probably come from the same regions, grown by descendants of the same workers, shipped along routes built a century ago by men who believed the world existed for their convenience. It's not a conspiracy. It's just momentum. History doesn't need villains when it has inertia. And as you peel that banana soft and sweet, it's worth remembering that its story isn't over. It's just quieter now. The guns are gone. The ships are cleaner. The ads are happier. But the balance of power, that part never changed. So when we talk about the banana wars, we're really talking about the long experiment of human greed, the way empires learn to survive by pretending they don't exist. The United Fruit Company may have disappeared from the headlines, but its descendants sit on every grocery shelf smiling back at you from their bright little stickers. A small logo with a big past. And maybe that's the secret to empire after all. Make it friendly, make it colorful, and make sure no one asks too many questions about where it came from. And so here we are. More than a century since the first crate of bananas left the tropics and sailed north to a country that would one day send Marines south in return. It's a strange symmetry. Fruit one way, soldiers the other. Commerce. Flowing out, control flowing in. You could almost call it balance if you ignored everything in between. The banana wars sound absurd when you say them out loud, like a joke from a parody of history. A powerful nation once invaded half a continent because of fruit, but that's what makes them so human. We like to imagine that wars are fought for noble reasons, for freedom, for security, for principle. But more often than not, they're fought for something you can hold, sell, or plant. And in the early 20th century, that thing just happened to be yellow, curved, and delicious on cereal. Think of the cast of characters we've met along the way. The businessmen in Panama hats, convincing themselves they were bringing civilization. The politicians, smiling as they signed papers that traded sovereignty for stability. The workers, sweating in fields that never belonged to them. The Marines, standing guard over plantations they'd never eat from. And somewhere in the background, always, a ship, filled with fruit, bound for the United States. Its cargo hold heavy with profit and irony. If history were a bedtime story, which, conveniently, it is right now, the banana wars would be the cautionary kind. The kind you tell not to scare someone, but to remind them that power rarely needs to shout to get what it wants. Sometimes it just hums softly in the rhythm of a factory, the rustle of leaves, the quiet language of trade. And it always smiles. While doing it, United Fruit may be gone, but the world it helped create isn't. Its railroads became highways. Its plantations became industrial farms. Its playbook became standard business practice. Today, we don't send troops to protect bananas. We send trade delegations, investment funds, and corporate lawyers. The gunboats have Wi-Fi now. The flags have logos. And the manifest still reads profit, stability, freedom. In that order. But there's another side to the story, one that doesn't fit neatly into irony. Because for all the greed and absurdity, the banana wars left behind a strange sort of legacy: resilience. In the countries once called banana republics, new generations have grown up rewriting their histories, reclaiming their lands, and challenging the old patterns. They've built democracies, started movements, and produced art and music that carry the rhythm of resistance. The same soil that once grew exploitation now grows defiance. The same fruit that once symbolized control now reminds the world what that control cost. History, like the banana itself, eventually ripens. And when it does, it can't help but expose the bruises. Still, there's something darkly funny about it all. A multi-decade geopolitical saga born out of breakfast preferences. The world's greatest superpower nearly tripping over its own fruit shipments. An empire that wanted to look like a business, and a business that behaved like an empire. If you ever needed proof that capitalism and comedy share a thin border, look no further than the United Fruit Company. It was tragedy in the tropics, performed as a corporate farce, and yet the bananas kept coming. Through wars, scandals, coups, and PR disasters, people still wanted their fruit. Because in the end, taste is stronger than memory, and forgetting is the easiest luxury of all. So tomorrow morning, when you peel a banana for breakfast, pause for a second. You're holding one of history's most successful cover stories. A piece of tropical sunlight that once rewrote borders, toppled governments, and fooled the world into thinking it was just fruit. That's the story of America's banana wars. A saga of ambition, absurdity, and appetite. The kind of history that sounds made up until you realize it's too ridiculous not to be true. It's capitalism with a tan, imperialism with a better branding and comedy that wrote itself. One banana at a time. As you drift off now, imagine the ships again. The waves rocking gently. The night warm and still. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whistle. The sound of a freighter heading home. In its hold, thousands of bananas, stacked in neat rows, glowing faintly under the dim lights. And maybe, just maybe, the echo of a question whispered between the waves. Was it really worth it? History doesn't answer, of course, it just keeps sailing. Softly, endlessly, and always toward the next shore that promises something sweet. Good night, dreamer. Sleep well in America, the land that once went to war for bananas. In the next and final part, we'll return to the present, to the quiet comedy of it all, to the absurd truth that the world once went to war for bananas, and somehow we still haven't learned when to stop.